The mighty Galactic Empire had always known the key to successful expansion was in swift diplomacy and overwhelming force. They had spent centuries conquering and absorbing countless worlds, each more advanced than the last, each planet bowing to their superior technology and their unyielding will. The Empire was a vast network of alien species, all bound by their allegiance to the Xathar, the most feared and powerful species in the galaxy. Their reputation for both their intellectual cunning and military might made them a force to be reckoned with, but when the Empire turned its eyes to Earth, they found something far more unexpected than they had anticipated. Earth was a small planet at the farthest edge of the galaxy, barely on the radar of most galactic powers, but the Xathar had long since run out of truly challenging worlds to conquer, and Earth seemed like an easy target. It had been monitored for years, and while humanity was still in the early stages of technological development, they seemed to possess a certain spark of unpredictability that intrigued the Xathar. Despite the relative primitiveness of their technology, the humans' ability to rapidly evolve and adapt left them wondering if there was something more to Earth than met the eye. The Xathar sent their best diplomats to handle the situation. The mission was clear: engage with Earth's leaders, make a show of the Empire's grandeur and power, then offer them the choice to join the Empire or face destruction. They would bring their ships, the likes of which could decimate entire cities in minutes. Their weapons were unrivaled, and their tactics foolproof. At least that was the plan. The first communication was sent from a sleek Xathar warship that entered Earth's orbit, its message broadcast to all major governments on the planet in a tone so calm and authoritative it was impossible to mistake its seriousness. Earth was given a choice: join the Empire or be eradicated. Most of the world's leaders were left stunned in disbelief. A message so cold, so overwhelming, that none could truly understand the gravity of what it meant. Yet their best diplomats scrambled to respond with hasty plans and half-formed strategies. Some nations called for calm, while others readied their armies, but no one knew what to do. They had no idea how to confront something so powerful. And so it fell to Greg Thompson, a middle-aged diplomat who had no special training or preparation for an event like this, to handle the situation. He was sent as the representative of the United Nations, tasked with making first contact with the Xathar. Despite his reputation as a competent negotiator, Greg was completely unprepared for an alien species that could obliterate entire cities in an instant. Instead of feeling fear, Greg felt a certain panic as he stood before the Xathar envoy. His mind raced with thoughts of what to say, how to act, what was the protocol. When faced with such overwhelming power, all he could think was that he didn't want to mess this up, but mess it up he would. Greg was ushered into a grand hall where a team of Xathar diplomats stood waiting, their imposing presence filling the room. Their commander, Ambassador Orcs, looked down on Greg with an air of absolute superiority, his posture rigid and formal, a stark contrast to Greg's sweaty palms and nervous smile. Orcs spoke first in a voice that reverberated through Greg's chest, stating the purpose of their visit without any hesitation or sense of humor. As Orcs spoke, Greg could only think of one thing, a thought he knew was wildly inappropriate, but one that would not leave his mind. How could he help it? The aliens had given him such an opening. It was too perfect. He blurted out a response in the most awkward way possible. "Well, I guess it's nice to meet you folks here. Would you like some coffee and donuts?" Greg's words hung in the air for a moment, as if the universe itself had taken a pause, and then the silence shattered. Ambassador Orcs blinked twice, his eyes narrowing as he processed the words spoken by the human. Greg had no idea what he had just done. His nervous smile froze on his face as he realized that the words that had come out of his mouth probably weren't the best choice. He had meant it as a joke, a lighthearted way to break the tension, but to the Xathar it was a complete mystery. Orcs stood there unmoving, his expression unreadable. The rest of the alien diplomats shifted uncomfortably behind him, clearly unsure of how to respond. Greg cleared his throat and tried again, desperate to salvage the situation. "I mean, it's just that we like to offer people coffee and donuts when we meet them. It's a bit of a tradition." Zorx's antenna twitched in confusion, and Greg's heart sank with embarrassment. He was sure he had just completely bungled this moment of first contact. The Xathar had likely never even heard of coffee or donuts, let alone associated them with diplomacy. Zorks exchanged a glance with one of his aides who seemed just as confused. As he was, the aide slowly leaned in and whispered something in Zorks' ear. Zorks took a deep breath and looked back at Greg, still unsure of how to respond. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of awkward silence, Zorks spoke in a low voice. "We appreciate your hospitality, human, but we have no need for sustenance. We have come to discuss the future of your planet." Greg nodded as if he understood, but inside he was dying of embarrassment. The rest of the diplomatic team stood frozen, unsure whether to engage or retreat. They had no idea what to make of the situation. Greg decided to push forward and salvage the conversation with an attempt to sound more serious. "Right, yes, of course. I understand you're here to talk about the Galactic Empire and all that." He motioned vaguely, as if the entire situation were just a casual business meeting. "So, how does this work? Do you just conquer a planet and move on, or is there some sort of paperwork involved?" Greg could already hear how ridiculous the words sounded coming out of his mouth, but by now he was in too deep to stop himself. Zorks blinked again. This time his confusion was even more evident, but the other Xathar diplomats began to chuckle under their breath. Greg didn't know whether to be relieved or more mortified by this reaction. Zorks straightened his posture, clearly trying to regain some semblance of composure. "Your sense of humor is unorthodox, human, but we must remind you that the matter at hand is serious. Your planet is now under the jurisdiction of the Galactic Empire," he said, his voice returning to its formal tone. Greg smiled nervously, his mind racing for something to say that would get him out of the awkward mess he had created. "Oh, sure, serious stuff. I get it," Greg stammered. "But I mean, if we're going to be part of your empire, I hope there's some fun stuff too, right? I mean, what's the point of joining if you don't have access to some good entertainment, or maybe some space ice cream?" Zork's expression faltered again, and for a brief moment Greg thought he might have broken him this time. The Xathar diplomats exchanged glances as the laughter from earlier bubbled up again, though this time it was not the polite sort of laughter that came from the awkwardness of not understanding Greg's words. It was a full-blown burst of confusion and genuine amusement, something the Empire had not experienced before. It was as if Greg had somehow turned their perfectly serious diplomatic mission into an impromptu comedy show, and the Xathar didn't know how to handle it. The humor continued to grow in intensity as Zorks and his aides laughed harder than they had ever laughed before. The laughter echoed through the room, and Greg stood there feeling like he had stepped into a bizarre dream. Was this really happening? Were these aliens actually laughing at him? What had he said to cause such an outburst? He felt his face grow hot with embarrassment. But the Xathar didn't stop. They continued to chuckle to the point where it almost seemed like they couldn't control themselves at all. Zorks was clutching his sides, struggling to catch his breath, and the rest of his aides were shaking with laughter too. Greg awkwardly shifted on his feet, unsure whether he should join in or pretend this was all normal. Finally, Zorks managed to compose himself, but the smile on his face was still there, a grin that looked completely out of place on the serious ambassador of an intergalactic empire. "We are sorry, human," Zorks said, though his voice was still tinged with amusement. "Your humor is very unique. We did not expect this." Greg blinked in confusion. Was this some kind of test? Had he accidentally passed it with flying colors? Or was this a sign that he had just made things worse than ever? No problem at all. I guess it's just how we are. We like to laugh a lot," Greg replied with a nervous chuckle, hoping this would somehow clear up the situation. Zorks nodded, though his expression remained puzzled. "It is unusual for a species to greet us with such humor. Most species approach us with reverence or fear. They are too intimidated to make jokes," he said, his tone now slightly more serious, though the amusement was still present. Greg felt a little less awkward now. At least it seemed like Zorks was trying to make sense of his behavior, rather than outright rejecting him. But he still couldn't shake the feeling that he had completely botched this encounter. "Yeah, well, we humans aren't really into the whole intimidation thing. We prefer to keep things lighthearted, like a good laugh can solve a lot of problems," Greg said, smiling more genuinely now. The Xathar diplomats exchanged looks, clearly still unsure of how to react to Greg's nonchalant attitude. Zorks cleared his throat and motioned for one of his aides to bring out a display screen. The aide complied, and soon a holographic image appeared hovering in front of Greg. It was an image of the Xathar fleet, an impressive array of starships that seemed to stretch on for miles. Their technology was beyond anything Greg had ever seen, and for a moment he felt small and insignificant in comparison. But then he remembered how he had handled this whole situation so far. If humor was going to be his weapon, he'd better keep going. "So," Greg said, still trying to make the best of this, "that's a pretty cool fleet you've got there. Not sure how we could compete with that, but I bet it's not as good as some of the stuff we've got on Earth." Zorks raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "What do you mean human? What could you possibly have that could compare to our might?" he asked, clearly curious. Greg grinned. "Well, we have movies and TV shows that have space battles that are even bigger than that one. It's all fictional stuff, but we love it. It's like a whole genre." Zorks blinked a few times, then turned to his aides, who whispered amongst themselves. Greg could see that they were utterly confused, but they were also fascinated by this strange human ability to take everything lightly. Greg continued, "We even have stories about people who fight giant space robots or supervillains with lasers, and even laser swords. It's pretty wild. If you ask me." The Xathar diplomats had gone silent at this point. They didn't know whether to laugh again or try to process what Greg was saying. Zorks finally spoke. "We are not familiar with such things. Your entertainment is very different from ours," he said with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. "But I must admit it is amusing." Greg let out a relieved sigh. At least he hadn't completely lost them. Yet he'd just have to keep this weird conversation going and see where it led them. Greg could tell that Zorks and his aides were still processing his words, their minds struggling to comprehend the idea that humans could enjoy stories of giant robots fighting space battles and lasers flashing through the void. But Greg wasn't done yet. He could see that this was his chance to really show them just how different Earth was. He had to keep up the act, so he dove in deeper with enthusiasm. "Oh, and you should see some of our old sci-fi movies. They're classics, like these big spaceships fighting each other in a vacuum of space, and the soundtracks are all epic with these booming orchestras." Greg continued excitedly, gesturing with his hands like he was explaining the best thing in the universe. Zorks's face grew more and more perplexed. "You enjoy watching these battles, but they are fictional. These battles do not happen in real life," he asked, his voice incredulous. Greg laughed and shook his head. "Yeah, that's the whole point. They're for fun entertainment, but we've got whole fan clubs for these things. People dress up as their favorite characters from movies and even have conventions where they talk about it for hours like it's a serious thing." Zorks seemed to go silent for a moment, and then one of his aides whispered something into his ear. Zorks's antenna twitched as if he were trying to process this new information. Greg was on a roll now, and he wasn't going to stop. "We also have this thing called video games, where people pretend to be soldiers or space pilots battling aliens and robots with lasers too, and they compete for high scores and stuff. It's kind of like a sport, really." Greg grinned and leaned in as if sharing a big secret. "And we have tournaments for it too, big competitions, where the best of the best come together to show off their skills." Zorks's eyes widened slightly as he took in this new wave of information, clearly stunned by how far human creativity and imagination could stretch. "You compete for fun," Zorks said in a voice that was a mix of disbelief and curiosity. "And you fight in these battles even though you do not need to?" Greg nodded eagerly. "Yep, it's like a game. We love it. And the best part is we don't need to risk our lives to do it either. It's just for fun, no danger involved." Zorks looked at his aides again, and this time they all seemed to exchange confused glances, some of them even chuckling softly under their breath. It was clear that Greg had pushed their understanding of human culture into bizarre territory, but it was also becoming clear that they were starting to see humanity in a new light. "This is strange," Zorks said finally. "Your species seems to derive joy from things that others might find unnecessary. We have never encountered anything like this before." Greg shrugged. Well, that's the thing about humans. We find joy in all kinds of things. We make the most out of everything, even if it's something as silly as pretending to fight robots in space. We just enjoy the ride." Zork stood still for a moment before speaking again, his voice much softer this time. "Perhaps it is not so bad to be unpredictable." After all, Greg felt a strange sense of victory at those words. Zork was clearly still trying to figure out how to deal with humanity, but at least it seemed like they weren't dismissing them entirely. Greg chuckled to himself. "Yeah, we're full of surprises." And he was about to say something else when one of Zork's aides suddenly spoke up with a question. "So if these competitions are for fun, and no one is hurt, how do you measure victory? What makes someone the best?" Greg smiled and answered quickly, "Well, we measure it by who has the most fun." The Xathar diplomats stared at Greg for a long moment as if trying to understand his words, but they only seemed to deepen the confusion. "You measure victory by fun," Zork repeated slowly, his voice edged with disbelief. It was clear that this concept was something beyond their comprehension. Greg nodded eagerly. "Yep, exactly. You see, winning isn't always about power or superiority. It's about enjoying what you're doing and getting the most out of it," he said confidently. Zork tilted his head, his antennae twitching, as if he were trying to make sense of it all. "So if one enjoys losing, does that mean they are victorious?" Greg grinned. "Yeah, why not? If you had a good time, then you won. You see, we believe it's not just the outcome that matters, but the journey itself." Zork was silent for a moment, and then spoke again in a tone that was almost reflective. "Strange this is." Greg could tell that Zork was deep in thought, and the room had taken on a quieter atmosphere. Even the aides had stopped whispering and stood still as if waiting for something to happen. It was as if Greg had opened a door to a new way of thinking that no one had expected. Maybe it was the sheer absurdity of it all, or maybe it was the novelty of a species that didn't measure success through force and domination, but through enjoyment and camaraderie. Greg was beginning to feel like he had actually made some headway. Maybe the Empire wasn't going to wipe them out after all. Zork finally broke the silence, his voice calm, but with a hint of curiosity. "You say that winning isn't everything, yet your species continues to strive for victory in so many areas. You build your machines and your weapons for what if not to overcome others?" Greg chuckled. "Well, that's a bit complicated. You see, we create things to make our lives better, to help each other, to explore, and to learn. We compete, yes. But it's not just about beating others, it's about growing together and making things that make life easier, more fun, and more meaningful." Zork nodded, but he didn't seem entirely convinced. "It sounds illogical," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. Greg leaned forward and said earnestly, "It might sound that way to you, but trust me when I say that it works for us. Sure, there's conflict sometimes, but we try to resolve it with our minds and with our hearts rather than our fists." Zork raised an eyebrow. "And this has made your species stronger." Greg smiled. "In its own way, yes. We may not have the most powerful weapons in the galaxy, but we have something else that makes us unique: our ability to adapt to change and find joy. Even in the most difficult times, we can turn almost anything into something that brings us together." Zork was silent again, this time for a longer stretch, as if considering Greg's words. And for the first time, Greg noticed that the ambassador wasn't immediately thinking about conquering humanity, but was instead trying to understand what made them tick, what made them so different from the other species the Empire had encountered. Zork finally spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. Perhaps there is more to your species than we thought." Greg smiled to himself, feeling a bit more hopeful than he had earlier. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to make the Xathar see humanity in a new light. Maybe laughter and joy could really be the key to their survival after all. The room remained quiet for a moment as Zork seemed lost in thought, his aides exchanging glances, but not daring to interrupt. Greg could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him, and for a brief moment he wondered if he had said too much, or if his attempt to explain humanity had backfired. But then Zork spoke again, his voice slow and measured. "If what you say is true, if humanity can truly find strength in laughter and joy, then perhaps our initial assessment of your species was premature." Greg blinked in surprise, not expecting such a thoughtful response. "So you're saying there's hope for us, he asked cautiously. Zorks nodded, but there was something in his eyes that was hard to read. Hope is a strange word, but yes, I believe we have misunderstood you. Greg felt a sense of relief wash over him, but he didn't want to get his hopes up too soon. He knew better than to assume that this one conversation would change everything. But it was a start. Maybe there was a way for humanity to be more than just another planet to conquer. Maybe they could find a way to prove themselves valuable to the Galactic Empire. After all, well, if you're willing to listen, I'd be happy to tell you more about how we do things back on Earth, Greg said cautiously. Zorks raised an eyebrow. Continue, he said in a tone that suggested he was genuinely curious. Now Greg smiled and leaned forward. All right, so another thing we have on Earth is something we call sports. It's like a game, but a bit more competitive. He paused and watched as Zorks' eyes narrowed slightly. Games within games, Zorks muttered, as if the idea was strange, but worth exploring. Greg nodded enthusiastically. Exactly, we got sports of all kinds. Team sports, individual sports. It's like this big way to keep us fit and give us something to strive for. We might not be fighting aliens in space or piloting giant robots, but we get a lot of joy from competition. Zorks' aides were still silent, but they seemed less tense now. They were listening more intently than before. Greg could see they were processing everything he said, and for the first time since the beginning of this meeting they didn't seem ready to dismiss him entirely. So you compete to be the best, but also for fun? Zorks asked again. Greg grinned. Yep, that's the idea. We push ourselves to be the best we can be, but we also do it to have fun with friends and strangers alike. It's kind of like a big social event. Sometimes Zorks looked like he was thinking it over for a moment. Interesting, your species values the process of becoming better instead of simply dominating others, he said softly. Greg's heart skipped a beat. Had he actually gotten through to Zorks? Was the ambassador finally starting to understand what made humanity tick? Yeah, exactly. We want to keep improving and getting better in all kinds of ways, even if it's not always about beating someone else, Greg said, his voice growing more animated as he spoke. Zorks seemed to be pondering this new information carefully. Your values are unlike those of any species we have encountered before. You focus on cooperation and growth, rather than dominance and subjugation, Zorks said, his tone almost admiring now. It was such a far cry from the cold, superior tone he had first used when he arrived. Greg felt a surge of hope. This conversation might actually be leading somewhere. Greg smiled widely. We believe that working together and enjoying life is the best way to move forward as a species, even if we face challenges. Zorks nodded slowly. Perhaps there is something to be learned from you humans after all, he said thoughtfully, his voice carrying a tone of genuine consideration. Greg couldn't believe his ears. Was it possible that humanity had just won over the HFY? With laughter and sports, could humor really be the key to the galaxy's survival after all? The atmosphere in the room shifted as Zorks seemed to be reconsidering everything he had known about humanity up until now. The other Xathar diplomats remained quiet, watching the exchange unfold. Greg could tell that they were all trying to make sense of what he was saying, trying to reconcile their long-held beliefs about what made a species strong with the very unorthodox approach the humanity seemed to take. He could feel the tension slowly dissipating as Zorks seemed more open to hearing him out, but there was still a cautious air lingering around them. Greg leaned back in his chair, feeling a little more relaxed now that the conversation had turned in a more positive direction. So now that you understand a little more about us, how about we start thinking about how we can work together instead of just being at odds? Zorks regarded him with a steady gaze, his antennae twitching thoughtfully. You wish to join the Galactic Empire? He asked, his voice still serious but not dismissive. Greg held up his hands. Not exactly. I mean, I'm not saying we need to join you, but maybe there's a way to cooperate, work together in a way that benefits both of us. Zorks tilted his head slightly. Explain. Greg smiled. He could tell that Zorks wasn't just dismissing the idea outright now. Well, for one thing, we have a ton of resources that might be useful to your empire, and we're constantly innovating on Earth. We could share our tech and ideas with you, and in return, maybe you could help us develop some of our own advanced technology. We could work together on things like space travel or energy production, and who knows, maybe even learn more about your culture in the process." Zorks seemed to consider this proposal, his gaze steady and unblinking. "You think your species is ready to contribute to a galactic empire without subjugation?" he asked in a voice that almost seemed skeptical but curious. Greg nodded confidently. "Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've been building ourselves up for centuries. Now we've gone from fighting wars to working together as a planet. We've already proven that we can evolve and adapt quickly, so I think we're ready to contribute in a bigger way." Zork's eyes narrowed slightly as if weighing Greg's words. "And you think your species will remain united in such an endeavor? You are not divided by conflict?" Greg hesitated for a moment before responding. "Well, we've had our fair share of conflicts, sure, but we're learning to resolve them without violence. More often than not, we're finding ways to work together and create solutions rather than tear each other apart." Zorks was silent for a long moment, and for the first time Greg wondered if the ambassador might reject his proposal completely. But then Zork spoke again, his voice softer than before. "Your species is unusual, human, but there is something about your approach that is intriguing." Greg's heart raced as he processed Zorks' words. "So you're saying there's a chance?" he said with a grin. Zorks didn't smile, but his gaze was no longer as stern. "There is always a chance, but the path will not be easy. The Empire does not offer favors without a price." Greg nodded eagerly. "I'm not asking for favors, just a chance to prove ourselves, to show you that humanity has more to offer than you might think." Zork studied him for a moment before responding. "Very well, human. We will consider your proposal, but know this: if you truly wish to stand beside us, you must prove that your species can rise above its own limitations and embrace the challenges of the galaxy." Greg stood up, feeling a sense of pride swelling inside him. "We'll prove it to you, Zorks. We'll show you that humanity is ready for something greater." Zorks inclined his head slightly. "Then we shall see how you fare, human. But be warned, we do not easily forgive failure." Greg nodded firmly. "We won't fail," he said with determination. And as he looked around the room at the Xathar diplomats, he knew that this was just the beginning of something far bigger than he had ever imagined, something that could change the course of humanity forever. The following days were filled with intense preparations and anticipation. Greg and his team of diplomats worked tirelessly, carefully crafting strategies and proposals that would demonstrate humanity's readiness to cooperate with the Xathar. But beneath the surface of optimism, Greg knew the stakes were higher than they had ever been. Zorks' words echoed in his mind. "We do not easily forgive failure." The first challenge came sooner than expected. The Xathar, with their advanced technology and vast resources, wanted humanity to showcase their capabilities in a joint scientific project, a demonstration of innovation that could prove humanity's value. The problem: the Xathar were far ahead of them in nearly every field, and the pressure to impress was immense. Greg found himself in a high-tech laboratory, working late into the night, surrounded by human scientists who were just as nervous as he was. They were tasked with developing a new energy source, something that could rival the efficiency of the Xathar's own technology. The room was filled with the soft hum of machinery and the clinking of tools, but the silence of anxiety was thick in the air. "You think we can do this?" one of the scientists, Dr. Ilara, asked, glancing at Greg as she pored over calculations on a tablet. "The Xathar are light years ahead of us in terms of energy research. How do we even begin to compete with that?" Greg paced slowly, his mind racing. "We don't need to compete. We need to show them that we can think differently. We've always been good at adapting and finding creative solutions, right? Maybe that's what they need, something they haven't considered." Dr. Ilara raised an eyebrow. "You think we'll win them over by thinking outside the box?" "I think we don't have any other choice," Greg replied, running a hand through his hair. "It's either we find something that proves our worth, or we risk falling short of their expectations." That night, they worked tirelessly, pulling together every last bit of human ingenuity. They designed a prototype of a new energy cell, one that combined solar power, bioenergy, and quantum mechanics in ways the Xathar had never seen. The model wasn't perfect, but it was a step forward. It was proof of what humanity could achieve when given a chance. The next morning, the team presented their findings to Zorks and the Xathar delegation. As the model was activated, the room filled with an eerie, tense silence. The prototype hummed to life, energy flowing in a way that was completely unfamiliar to the Xathar. Zork stood stoically, his antennae twitching as he examined the display. The other Xathar diplomats murmured among themselves, clearly impressed, but Greg could still sense their skepticism. They didn't yet know what to make of this human ingenuity. "Your species has surprised us, human," Zork said finally, his voice thoughtful but still distant. "This energy system is unlike anything we have encountered." Greg held his breath, waiting for the catch. Zorks continued, his gaze unwavering. "It is an interesting concept, but it is still rudimentary. You may have taken the first step, but the journey ahead will test you in ways you cannot predict. I will allow you to prove your worth in one more endeavor. Complete this challenge, and we will consider your proposal further." Greg's heart pounded in his chest, and he stood taller, his voice unwavering. "We're ready. Tell us what we need to do." Zork's eyes narrowed, a faint hint of amusement in his otherwise stoic expression. "Very well. We have one last task for you, a demonstration of your species' ability to adapt and work under pressure. A task that will require more than just intellect. It will require cooperation and resolve. We will send you into one of our most dangerous environments. If you succeed, you will have proven humanity's worth." Greg exchanged a glance with his team. The challenge was set. It was clear now. There was no turning back. Humanity had been given a chance, and it was up to them to rise to the occasion. As Greg stood before the Xathar delegation, he felt the weight of the moment press down on him. This was it. The future of humanity was in their hands.